Once upon a time, quite close to here actually, there was a wild and wonderful forest. The forest was full of friendly folk, but there were also some scary parts of the forest, with ferocious and sneaky beasts. One of these creatures was a wolf. He was big and he was bad, and he was always trying to gobble up the friendly folk. The friendly folk knew this, and they told stories to their children about the big bad wolf, about how he would try to trick them, how he was clever and ruthless, and he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. Over the years, the friendly folk became wise to the wolf's sneaky tricks, and they weren't so easy for the wolf to trick anymore. And so the wolf went away to try to find a village full of people who weren't so clever. This made the friendly folk very happy, as the danger that prowled just beyond the tree line was no longer there. Slowly, the grown-ups started to let the children play deeper into the woods, or skip along the banks of the stream, or walk to the older cottages in the centre of the forest to deliver bread or letters. Anyway, back to Little Red Riding Hood. Remember her? One day, she was called into the kitchen by her mother. "Your grandmother isn't feeling well," she said. "I've baked a pie for her. Will you take it to Granny's cottage to cheer her up?" Red loved her granny, and she was so excited to go and see her that she did a little dance before rushing out of the door so fast she almost forgot the basket. Her mother gave her a big hug and said, "Watch out for the big bad wolf," and they both laughed, as this wasn't really a warning anymore, not like it used to be. It was just something people said. As Little Red Riding Hood skipped along the path, she admired the blossoms and whistled back to the songbirds singing in the trees. She loved the forest in spring. The smell of the wild garlic, the tap-tap-tapping of the woodpeckers. She felt the woods come alive around her, and she felt more at home than she did by the fire in her own little cottage. Quite suddenly, Red noticed that the birds had stopped singing. The air had a chill in it, and the blossoms even seemed to curl in on themselves, away from whatever threat was in the air. Red stopped and looked around, holding on more tightly to her basket. Suddenly, a deep voice spoke. "Good morning, Little Red Riding Hood." Startled, she turned around and saw him. He was huge and grey, and he was standing up on his hind legs, so he was much taller than a man. He had sharp teeth and a cunning smile. "Good morning," she replied politely, though she could feel her heart hammering against her chest. "And where are you going on this fine day?" asked the wolf, leaning forward and showing her his toothy grin. "I'm going to Granny's cottage," Little Red Riding Hood said. "My grandmother isn't feeling well, and I'm bringing her a pie." The wolf's eyes gleamed and his mouth watered. "How kind of you," he said. "Do you know, there's a lovely patch of bluebells just over that ridge. I'm sure it would cheer her to have a bunch by her bed." What a kindly wolf, Red thought. Perhaps those silly children's tales are just a load of old rubbish. Red smiled and waved at the wolf as she set off to find the bluebells. The wolf chuckled to himself as he slunk on down the path towards Granny's cottage. Before long, Red was at the door of Granny's cottage with the basket in one hand and a generous bouquet of bluebells in the other. She tapped gently at the door, and a strangely quiet voice said, "Come in, dear." Red let herself in and looked around. It was dark and dingy, and there was a peculiar chill inside the cottage. She could see her grandmother in bed in the corner. She had the covers pulled right up to her chin, and there was something strange about her face. "Come closer, dear. Come and sit by me," she called. Red thought to herself, "Oh dear, Grandmother must be worse than I thought. She never has all of the curtains closed, and she always has a fire crackling away in the hearth." Little Red Riding Hood had always been a practical sort of girl, so she rolled up her sleeves and got to work. "Don't worry about me, Granny," she called into the dark. "I'll get this place shipshape in no time." Red poured some water into a jug for the bluebells and set to sweeping the floor and starting the fire. She started to open the curtains when she heard a funny, muffled sort of sound coming from a broom cupboard. Red stopped and looked around, But Granny started coughing and said, "Come closer, dear. I'd like to look at you. It's been so long since you visited." Well, that was definitely strange. Red and the other children came to Granny's cottage to bake cookies and hear Granny's stories twice a week. Had the old woman bumped her head? Red brought the jug of bluebells over to the bed, thinking they would brighten her Granny's mood. As she got closer, she couldn't believe what strange effects this illness had had on the woman in the bed. "Oh, Grandmother," Red said, "what big ears you have." "All the better to hear you with, my dear," the figure in the bed replied. "And Grandmother, what big eyes you have," said Red. "All the better to see you with, my dear," the strange creature said. "And Grandmother, what big teeth you have," cried Red. "All the better to eat you with," roared the wolf, throwing off the covers and going to leap from the bed. Little Red Riding Hood was so shocked she didn't have a second to make a plan. She just used what she had in her hands. Quick as a flash, she lifted the bluebell jug in the air and smashed it down on the wolf's head, sending a spray of water, sharp shards of pottery, and 100 bluebells showering all over the place. The wolf was out cold on the floor. Just then, Red's real Granny came bursting from the broom cupboard in her nightie. Red and Granny hugged and then got to work tidying up the mess. They tied up the wolf and carried him down to the river, where they put him in Granny's old rowing boat and floated him away. The wolf was never seen again. Later, while Red and Granny finished the pie, they decided that seeing as the wolf problem was solved, there was no good reason to worry the other grown-ups in the forest. After all, they would never allow the children to play amongst the trees, skip along the stream, or walk to cottages deep in the forest anymore if they found out. It would stay their secret. And so, the children kept coming to Granny's cottage to hear her stories. Even when Red grew old and moved into the cottage herself, the children still come. And I always kept the secret. Well, until now, of course. Snow White. Once upon a time, a long, long time ago and far, far away, there was a kingdom. And in the kingdom, there was a young princess called Snow White. Snow White's mother had died when she was very young, and her father, the king, had gotten married again. The new queen had a secret magical mirror. And every day, just after breakfast, she would ask it, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" You might think, oh, that's nice. She wanted to make sure she was the fairest, kindest, most just queen in the land. But unfortunately, you'd be wrong. Because fair doesn't just mean good and kind. She didn't care about that. Not one bit. Fair also means beautiful. And this was really all the new queen cared about. She wanted to be the most beautiful and most powerful ruler in the land, and she would stop at nothing to achieve this. Anyway, every day she asked the mirror who was the fairest, and every day the mirror replied, "My queen, my every word is true. The fairest one of all is you." She liked that. Years went by, and Snow White grew into a young woman. And much to the queen's annoyance, she became more and more beautiful. One morning, when the queen asked her mirror who was fairest, it replied, "My queen, my every word is right. The fairest one is young Snow White." At first, the queen was shocked, and then she became terribly angry. She couldn't bear being second best. Something would have to be done. The queen called for the royal huntsman and ordered him to take Snow White into the forest and get rid of her. The huntsman was very loyal to the queen, and he really wanted to do a good job. But unfortunately for the queen, he wasn't particularly bright. So he took Snow into the forest, just as the queen had asked, and he gave her a warm cloak and a packed lunch and sent her on her way, telling her never to return. Poor Snow White knew that the queen had never been particularly fond of her, but she didn't think she would resort to this kind of treatment. Never mind, she thought. If I keep calm and do my best, I'm sure things will work out. Snow White was always saying clever things like that. She strolled through the forest and eventually came across a sweet little cottage, and, full of hope, she knocked on the door. There was no answer, but it was starting to get dark, and Snow White knew that she would need to find somewhere to rest for the night. So she gently pushed open the door and went inside. The cottage was tiny but tidy, with 7 little chairs and 7 little beds. Snow White was so tired that she lay down on one of the beds and fell fast asleep. She slept for a long time in the comfy little bed. She awoke when the sun came streaming onto her pillow to the delicious smell of bacon and eggs sizzling away in the kitchen. She sat up suddenly, feeling a little worried about who had come home to find her asleep in their bed. Would she be in trouble? She silently crept down the stairs and found that the little home was all hustle and bustle, with 7 little men cooking, setting the table and pouring cups of tea. As one, they looked up and smiled. "Good morning, Princess," one of them said. "We hope you slept well." Snow White didn't know what to think. They showed her to a seat and gave her a lovely steaming cup of tea and told her how rumours of her beauty had reached the forest, and as soon as they saw her, they knew it must be her. Snow was relieved to have found such wonderful friends, and they were pleased to welcome her into their little family, and by the time they'd finished their breakfast, they'd all decided that she would stay forever. Across the kingdom, the Queen had just finished her breakfast too. She went to her magical mirror and, thinking the huntsman had truly gotten rid of Snow White, waited to be named fairest one of all as before. But the mirror spoke the truth, as always, and named Snow White instead. In a rage, she went to the huntsman and screamed, "I told you to get rid of that pesky princess!" "I did," he said. "I took her into the woods and told her to never come back." "That's not what I meant," she shrieked. "I meant get rid of her forever, with your axe." "Oh," said the huntsman. "My bad." The Queen decided that if she wanted a job done properly, she would have to do it herself. So she disguised herself as a kindly-looking peddler woman and went off to find Snow White. It didn't take long to find her. She followed the sounds of cheerful singing and merry laughter that led straight to the dwarf's cottage. She waited until Snow White was alone and knocked on the door. The Queen's disguise fooled the trusting Snow White, who invited her in for a lovely cup of tea. Inside, the Queen offered Snow a beautifully shiny red apple. The fruit looked juicy and crunchy and sweet, and Snow White didn't want to be rude, so she took a huge bite. Straight away, she fell to the floor unconscious. The Queen cackled and fled, leaving the poisoned apple and Snow White on the ground where they fell. When the dwarfs came home, they found Snow White lying still and cold. They were heartbroken and placed her on a comfortable bed with a glass cover over the top, so they could always look upon her beautiful face, and they could keep watch over her, day and night, as days turned to weeks and then to months. After a while, a handsome prince who had heard tales of Snow White's beauty came to the kingdom. When he saw her lying unmoving in the glass case, he was devastated and started to cry. The dwarfs took pity on him and invited him inside to rest a while. They told him the story of how they found Snow White lying unconscious on the floor and how there was a beautiful apple just next to her. They told him how strange it was that all these months later, the apple hadn't rotted away. It looked just as juicy and delicious as it did the day Snow White took the fateful bite. The prince took one look at the apple and knew straight away that it was magical and that there could be hope for Snow White. He rushed outside, lifted the glass cover and gently opened her mouth and saw that the bite of apple was still stuck in her throat. The prince was very clever and very sensible, and he knew first aid. So, with a few pats on the back, the piece of apple came flying out of Snow White's mouth, and straight away she woke up to find all of her beloved dwarfs and the handsome prince all crowded around her. Everyone was overjoyed. Everyone, that is, apart from the Queen. After months of being deemed the fairest again by the mirror, Snow White's rescue from her magical sleep meant the mirror named her as the most beautiful in the kingdom once more. Consumed by her jealousy, the queen tried to brew a magical potion to make her become even more beautiful. But she got the ingredients wrong, and instead of becoming more beautiful, she actually turned herself into a toad. Horrified, she jumped into a river and was never seen again. Snow White and the prince returned to the castle and were married the very next day, surrounded by their very best friends, the Seven Dwarfs. And they all lived happily ever after. The end. Cinderella. Once upon a time, there was a young girl named Cinderella. She lived with her dad, her stepmother, and her 2 stepsisters. Now, most step families are lovely, kind people, but Cinderella's stepmother wasn't, and her stepsisters were absolutely horrid. One day, Cinderella's dad said, "I have to go away for a while. I will come home soon. Look after each other." But while he was hugging his wife goodbye, Cinderella's stepsisters were already pinching Cinderella and pulling her hair. They loved to boss her around. "Cinderella, wash my clothes. Cinderella, scrub my toilet. Cinderella, make me another glass of orange squash." Cinderella's clothes became dirty and tattered, and when she asked for new clothes, her stepmother only laughed at her, while her stepsisters had new dresses every week. One day, a smart man in a fancy coat came to the house with a long scroll. "On behalf of the prince, all the young single ladies in the kingdom are hereby invited to a great big party at the palace tomorrow night. Be there or be square." He looked at stepmother. "The prince is looking for a bride," he whispered with a wink. Cinderella's stepmother was very excited. That night, she dreamed of the jewels and dresses she could buy if one of her daughters became queen. Cinderella's stepsisters were very excited too. They both dreamed of being married to the very handsome prince and having servants and maids and cooks and cleaners, hundreds of people to boss around instead of just one. Cinderella just dreamed of getting out of the house for a couple of hours. The next day, Cinderella's stepsisters spent hours getting ready for the party. They caught Cinderella looking through her old dresses. "You don't think you'll be going to the party, do you?" they said, and they laughed and laughed. Cinderella went to her stepmother and begged her. "Please," she said, "I won't get in the way, I promise." Her stepmother thought about it for a moment, and then a cruel smile curled on her lips. "Of course you may go to the party, Cinderella, just as soon as you've finished your chores." Cinderella worked harder than ever. She even helped her stepsisters paint their horrible toenails on their huge stinky feet. When she was finished, she found an old pink dress and tried her best to fix some of the holes. She brushed her hair and scrubbed her face until she almost felt clean. "Time to go, daughters," called stepmother. "Don't you all look lovely?" Cinderella's heart skipped a beat. Her stepmother had never said anything so nice to her before, or called her daughter. Maybe things were going to change for the better. But then, stepmother said, Cinderella, haven't you forgotten something?" Cinderella looked herself up and down. "I don't think so, stepmother." "The kitchen?" Cinderella was confused. She most certainly had not forgotten to clean the kitchen. She'd polished the surfaces, scrubbed the floor, she'd even cleaned the stove and reorganised the pantry. She had left it all sparkling. Stepmother slowly pushed open the door and Cinderella gasped. There was mess everywhere. A bag of flour had been knocked all over the floor. A pot looked like it had been left to boil over and had left a sticky pink mess all over the stove. Someone had made scrambled egg and left the pan for her to clean. That would be half an hour on its own. Cinderella's heart sank down to her toes. "Stepmother, perhaps I could finish this after the party," she said. "Absolutely not," her stepmother said cruelly. "We had an agreement, Cinderella." And with that, she hurried the 2 horrid stepsisters out of the house and off to the party. Cinderella was heartbroken. She just wanted to get out of the house and feel like a normal girl, just for a couple of hours. She started scrubbing the egg pan, and as she did, she started to cry. She closed her eyes and wished for a miracle. "Don't cry, Cindy," said a voice, and Cinderella turned to see a little old woman in a sparkling robe sitting on the table. The fairy godmother clicked her fingers and the kitchen was spotless, even the egg pan. Cinderella just looked at her with her mouth open, but the magical old woman wasn't finished yet. She clicked her fingers again, and Cinderella's grubby old dress transformed into a gorgeous sparkly gown. On her feet were a pair of beautiful and unexpectedly comfortable glass slippers. Cinderella was amazed. She started to say thank you, but the fairy godmother said, "Oh, we haven't got time for all that. We've got to get you to the party." She looked around and said, "You don't happen to have any animals around here, do you?" The fairy godmother clicked her fingers once more, and they found themselves outside. 6 mice were lined up in front of a pumpkin. A horse was standing next to it, and a dog was waiting patiently at the back. Cinderella thought maybe the fairy godmother's magic had run out, or that maybe she herself was going a bit mad. But at another click of her fingers, the fairy godmother changed the mice into 6 horses, the horse into a driver, and the dog into a footman, and the pumpkin into the most beautiful golden carriage. Cinderella was stunned. "Now, Cindy, there's only one thing to remember. You must leave the party before midnight. Promise?" "Promise," said Cinderella, and she kissed the fairy godmother on the cheek before climbing into the carriage. When Cinderella arrived at the palace, she didn't want to waste any more time and hurried up the steps. The music was absolutely wicked, and Cinderella couldn't help but run to the dance floor and start throwing some wild shapes. The prince noticed her right away. All the other girls were standing around, too nervous to dance, but this girl could really move. He joined her, and the pair of them danced together all night. It was heaven. Cinderella saw her stepmother and sisters watching her, and she suddenly remembered the fairy godmother's warning. She checked the clock and saw it was almost midnight. "I've got to go!" she shouted, and she tried to give the prince her name, but the music was too loud and he couldn't hear her. She turned and ran from the dance floor in such a hurry that she left one of her glass slippers behind. She ran all the way home and went straight to bed, still dreaming of the prince and his amazing dance moves. The very next day, the fancy coat man was back with another scroll. "The prince would like to find and marry the girl in the sparkly dress with the radical dance moves," he announced. He didn't quite catch her name, but this is her shoe, and he held up the glass slipper she had dropped. Cinderella's sisters looked at each other for a moment, and then both shrieked, "It's mine! It's mine!" Cinderella watched as each sister tried on the shoe and tried not to laugh when their great big smelly feet simply would not fit. Cinderella said, "May I try?" Her stepmother was furious and tried to push her back into the kitchen, but the fancy coat man frowned at her and said, "All the young ladies must try the shoe, even the grubby ones." Cinderella slipped the shoe on with ease and smiled at the fancy coat man as she pulled the other one from her pocket. Cinderella's stepmother and sisters couldn't believe their eyes. "You!" they cried. But quickly they realised that they would still get to be part of the royal family and said, "Oh, Cinderella, how exciting! We can't wait for the royal wedding." Cinderella frowned and said, "Aren't you forgetting something?" Her stepmother and sisters stopped jumping up and down and said, "What?" "You'll have to finish your chores first," said Cinderella. And with that, she left the house and her stepmother and sisters and went off to marry the prince. And they lived happily ever after. What became of the stepmother and sisters, you ask? Well, after a while, Cinderella's dad came home from his travels, and he gave them a pretty serious telling off for being so horrid. After that day, they promised to be nice to everyone forever. And wouldn't you believe it? They actually were. The end. The Boy Who Cried Wolf. Once upon a time, in a small village, there lived a young boy who spent all of his days sitting high up on a hill under a maple tree. He had just one job, to watch over the sheep from the big, bad wolf. The wolf, too, had just one job: to hunt down sheep to satisfy his hunger. The boy often found himself bored. Guarding the sheep day in, day out left him wishing for a different job, or perhaps some excitement. More than anything, he hated sitting alone all day, every day. So, one day, he decided to shout, "Help! Help! A wolf is chasing the sheep, and they're all running away!" The villagers heard the boy's cries, and they all dropped what they were doing and quickly rushed to help. But when they reached the top of the hill, there was no wolf, just the boy and the sheep, peacefully resting in the greenest grass you could imagine. "Where is the wolf?" the villagers asked. "There is no wolf," the boy said, unable to stop himself from laughing. The villagers were upset. They were exhausted from running and frustrated about their interrupted work. One of the men turned around and shouted at the boy, "Don't cry wolf when there is no wolf around. Only call for help when you truly need it." The boy found all of this very amusing. He was quite the little prankster and enjoyed seeing people rush up the hill for no reason. So, the next day, the boy walked up the hill with his flock. He cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled again. "Help! Wolf! Help me! He's going to eat all the sheep in my flock!" Once more, the villagers dropped what they were doing and ran up the hill. And once again, there was no wolf. "Where is the wolf?" the villagers asked. "There is no wolf," the boy replied, and once again he couldn't help but laugh. Again, a man turned and firmly said, "Don't cry wolf when there isn't one around. Only call for help when you truly need it." The next morning, the boy went up the hill with his flock again. And wouldn't you know it, this time, he actually saw a real wolf hiding in the nearby forest. At first, the boy didn't know what to do, but then he started yelling, "Help! Wolf! Help!" The people in the village heard his cries, but this time they knew better and didn't come running up the hill. The villagers kept hearing his cries, but didn't move an inch. They wouldn't fall for the same trick again. Now all the sheep ran away and were lost, chased off by the wolf. The boy was very saddened by this and sat down by the tree again. But this time, there was no smile on his face. At the end of the day, the villagers waited as usual for the boy to bring back the flock of sheep. But that evening, the boy didn't return. They decided to go and see what was wrong. The villagers gathered around the boy. Through his tears, he asked, "Why didn't you come to help me? A big bad wolf chased all the sheep away. I yelled and yelled, but no one came to help." The villagers were angry because their sheep were lost. The man who had always advised the boy to stop yelling as a joke said, "Now you see, no one believes a liar. How are we supposed to know if it was real or if you just did it for your amusement again?" From that day on, the boy always told the truth. Or at least he tried to. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this magical story. If you want to come along on more of our adventures, make sure you subscribe to our channel. There's so much more to be discovered. You can start right now by clicking on our channel and picking your next favourite tale. There really is something for everyone, from daring heroes and mischievous creatures to magical lands and secret wonders. And remember, by subscribing, you'll be the first to know when a brand new story is ready to be enjoyed. Let's go.